Hello, everybody. So, welcome to the next installment of the discipleship program that we're going to be doing here. We are going to be tackling today the topic of Niddah. Now, if you don't know, this is a pretty personal and sometimes sensitive subject. Is just one of those that it's like not super comfortable to talk about sometimes, right? But we're going to just go ahead and approach it with maturity, and we're going through kind of a life cycle theme right now. If you haven't noticed, so we just covered marriage. Now we're going to talk about Niddah. So as we get into this, I'm going to go ahead and just give us a broad overview, and some of this is going to be focusing on what Scripture says. A part of it is going to be focusing on Tractate Niddah, and we are going to talk about some really interesting things in that. Now, what I want to point out, a lot of people do actually say that Tractate Niddah is the hardest one in Talmud. There are, I think, a couple reasons for that. One of them being that, yeah, Niddah is just not the simplest thing to understand. There's counting and calendars and cycles and exceptions and all these different kinds of things that need to go into the parameters that are being set, right? The other side of that being that there are things that are brought up in the tractate that are difficult subjects, and we'll get there. So there are things that even then that can be a difficult one to read and one to get through. The other side of that then being that there are this is just one of those sensitive topics, and so when we say that it's difficult to get into, it's just something where it's kind of awkward. And but all the better that I don't even want to approach this. Of course, I'm happy to present this from the female standpoint, because that's definitely part of it, but it's not as if this is something only for women. This is something that men need to observe as well, because you're going to bring this into your home, right? This is something that you and your wife are going to walk through together, and so there are different things that you might as well just know what this is all about. So, we are going to be talking about some sensitive topics and some adult things. So let's go. Let's be mature, and let's go ahead and move on through what this subject has to offer us. So, Niddah. The word itself is comes from H 5079. The root, actually, nadad, means to retreat, to flee, to wander, and to be chased. That's kind of interesting. So the word niddah most often is actually translated as separation. There are several different ways that it comes, but if you're going to look up what word this is, in the time of her separation is where you're going to see this occur a lot. There is an implication of rejection because of the impurity. So where you can see with the root nadad, to retreat, to flee, to wander, to be chased, that niddah is that separation period because of the uncleanliness and the state of impurity. So Niddah basically is focused on in the in Torah in Leviticus 15. So that chapter deals with it most directly, and we'll get into it a little bit more as to what that's actually talking about. There is an occurrence of the word in Leviticus 18 verse 9, chapter 18 verse 19, as well as chapter 20 and verse 21. A man shall not take his brother's wife, because that is niddah. Interesting, okay? So the water that is mixed with the ash of the red heifer, and Numbers 19:9, that which is put aside to use to cleanse the tabernacle and to cleanse the children of Israel, the red heifer, right? That water is called the water of separation. It's lemen niddah. Niddah is the word that's used there, is the water of separation. Think about that. So a good chunk of Talmud on the subject details that the impurity and the impurity of a corpse, the menstrual impurity and the impurity of a corpse are viewed kind of the same way. This comes from the parameters that are set about in Numbers 19 that require that one who has encountered a dead body is to be purified with the waters of separation, Niddah, the waters of Niddah. So another occurrence would be that when Hezekiah seeks to restore things, he says, carry forth the filthiness, Niddah, from the holy place. So carry away the impurity. They had made the temple Niddah. In Ezra 9, the land is described as Niddah. Ezekiel has some interesting idiomatic occurrences because chapter 7 says they cast their silver in the streets, their gold shall be removed. The Hebrew being that their gold is considered Niddah. In their defilement of the temple in verse 20, chapter 7, verse 20 of Ezekiel, they have set it far from them, implying that they view it as detestable. Niddah. The temple, the glory of the temple, they are viewing as Niddah. Okay, so those are going to be some really interesting verses. I actually recommend that you just go read Ezekiel chapter 7 and kind of get a new appreciation for what's happening there. It's not really a happy thing, but it's very interesting when you know the words. So Ezekiel 36 then says in verse 17, Son of man, when the house of Israel dwelt in their own land, they defiled it by their own way and by their doings. Their way was before me as the uncleanness of a removed woman. Niddah. Zechariah 13:1 says, In that day there shall be a fountain opened up to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanliness. Niddah. So that fountain that comes that is going to be there for the sake of cleansing is of the cleansing of Niddah. Now, Leviticus 15 is the chapter that deals most with the separation requirements of Niddah. It sets up the scenario of the issue of blood. So when we in English hear the word issue, we think problem, right? But issue is actually Old French meaning exit. It means way out. The Hebrew word is zuv. So when there is an issue of blood, and you can see this in chapter 15, verse 19, when there's an issue of blood, her separation is 7 days. The thing she lays on, or the person that she touches, or the person that touches her is to be unclean until the evening. Doesn't require the same period of separation. However, if a man were to lie with her during that period of time, he's also unclean for 7 days. And we'll come back to this a little bit when we talk about Talmud. Verse 25 starts to refer more to what Talmud refers to as Zav. Verse 28 says that once the issuance is over, she shall observe 7 clean days as if she were in her normal 7-day separation. Okay, so basically what that means is that there is a period of time that is a normal cycle for a woman, right? Once that blood is spotted, then there is a 7-day period where she is considered Niddah. Now, as it's laid out in Torah, if there is a separate issuance of blood, where then that would put her in a period where she's considered Niddah for 7 days, but she's Zav. She's also has to observe 7 clean days after that period of blood has ended. Presumably the woman who has the issue of blood, when she reaches out and touches Yeshua's garment, she has never actually stopped bleeding. So she's never been able to have a observance of 7 clean days. So she's considered continually in her menstrual impurity. Okay, so what has happened then is that some do observe a full 14-day period of separation because they're putting together both the parameter for the Niddah and for the Zav. Even when a woman just has a regular period, sometimes she will set apart 14 days. Now, what is happening there is that there have been times when there was ambiguity in the distinction between Azav and Niddah. So some people basically just chose to play it safe. But it's also crucial to understand that not every woman is the same, and not every cycle is the same. Therefore, there is such a thing as halachic infertility. It's better to be loose in the matter of halakha and be strict in the matter of Torah, right? So there is a command to be fruitful and multiply. If a woman's cycle lays out in a way that a 14-day period would actually set she and her husband outside of her ovulation cycle, that's not okay. You should just then back it up, because really the Torah commandment seems to be, and it's not super clear, but we can talk about this if you have questions. The one who is Niddah is to observe that once she sees the blood, is to observe 7 days of separation. That once those 7 days are done, no matter when the blood came within that period, whether it was 2 days, 5 days, 7 days, there is a 7-day period of separation. Presumably, then, if there were to be blood beyond those days of 7 days of separation, that would make her zav. That would be something that would not be part of a regular cycle, and therefore would be considered an issuance of blood that is not natural. Or I can't remember even the word. Of course, it doesn't use natural. That there's something that is. It's not on her normal issuance of blood. That if there's something that comes afterward, then she is to count in probably an additional 7 days. If that is the first start of one of those that is like, wait a second, that can't be right. And then that there would be observed 7 clean days. Some will take, even just in their regular period, will observe the 7 days of separation as Niddah, and then will add the 7 additional days to observe 7 clean days. That, again, is something that needs to be viewed in light of each woman's individual cycle and the reality of what God has created her body to do. There is and the beauty of that being that there is some benefit to taking the extra period of time, and we'll talk about that, but also that there's not necessarily, it has become a fail-safe to conflate the two. Technically, there are 2 different periods of what a woman is experiencing to be either Niddah or Zav. Okay. Couples observe the separation in different ways. Some don't share the same bed, some don't touch, some don't speak to one another flirtatiously, and frankly, some don't concern themselves with any of that. So the point is that one not engage in the sexual act during a woman's period of separation. If you feel tempted during that period, do what you can to avoid those temptations. But there's no need to impose a strict halakha on yourself if you could just as easily avoid a temptation otherwise, right? If you don't want to make these things a burden when the yoke is light. So don't impose something more on yourself to I can't even think of the right word to make. Don't make this harder on yourself, okay? Let's just make it simple. Let's go ahead and move into what some Mishnah says on the subject, right? Because there's plenty. Right at the beginning of the Mishnah, tractate Niddah, granted, Shammai says, for all women who do not have a fixed menstrual cycle, their time is sufficient. Okay? So it's not even really just a loose interpretation that's getting me to the point where I'm saying you can be a little bit more lenient as far as just doing the 7-day period of separation. This is also something that that Talmud speaks extensively on, about those that have a fixed menstrual cycle and those that don't. An inconsistent cycle, okay, this is where it gets a little complicated. An inconsistent cycle should start retroactively by 24 hours. Okay, presumably there is a practice of observing and checking for blood. Okay. If that is consistently being done and if no blood is seen, then only when the blood is seen does the count actually start. If that check is not being consistently done and blood is just kind of found, there is supposed to be a retroactive period of 24 hours to actually back it up and say, ooh, everything you just touched for this period was probably unclean. Basically, what that's doing is applying to the ritually pure objects that are the consequential point of Niddah anyway. Okay, we'll come back to that. Assuming that when they examined that there was no blood, okay, in the examination that there was no blood within a 24-hour period prior to what then would be considered the first sighting, there's a debate whether that count starts at the beginning of one's last examination or from when the blood is seen. There is a debate between two rabbis about whether or not that's which one you're going to choose. And some of this actually dictates whether there is retroactive impurity over that last 24-hour period. And there are actually four types of women that would be considered impure only from the moment that they see the blood. So that would be a virgin, a pregnant woman, a nursing woman, or an elderly woman. And believe me, if you are curious of, well, what's a virgin, what's a pregnant woman, what's a nursing woman, what's an elderly woman, Tractate Niddah will tell you if you want to go find it. So there is a discussion for each one to lay out those parameters. So basically, what that backs up to is that those who might have to consider the retroactive impurity of the 24-hour period would be the married woman who is not pregnant. Okay, so the idea that she is likely to have regular relations with her husband, and that because she doesn't want to make him also niddah, that she should be checking and should be aware that, oh, honey, I actually observed blood, and so you are now unclean also for 7 days. Okay, that's where this comes in. So, let's keep moving. A big component of the Niddah period is whether her impurity is regarding her handling of ritually pure items. So, going to the temple was a big deal. That was really what is being focused on a bit more, right? If there is something that she touches, it makes that impure. If she makes her husband impure, he can't go to the temple. If she touches the beds and then he goes and lays on the bed, he's unclean until the evening, and then he needs to go do a mikveh, and then he can go do the temple. So those kinds of steps and parameters are the things that we're trying to be aware of when we're doing all of this. So if a husband and wife engage in sexual intercourse, examine themselves afterward, and find blood, they're both unclean for 7 days. They're also meant to bring a sin offering, even because they did take part even in an unintentional sin. Okay, so there are parameters in Torah for unintentional sin. Talmud gets really descriptive about the discernment of blood. If you are squeamish in any way about such things, I give you a fair warning about actually going and reading the tractate. I'm not going to get into it here because even I was like, whoa. So just that's in section 2 if you want to skim through it. Part 3 of the tractate Niddah starts to discuss miscarriage. Again, the details of which are very graphic. The period of separation after childbirth is dependent upon the sex of the baby. So again, with all of this as a subject, it requires a lot of sensitivity, can be difficult to read. A portion of the third tractate deals with the various stages of development that are observed in a miscarriage and how long one should separate then based on the state of the fetus and whether it can be determined what the sex was. So, there are other parts of Talmud that describe that Samaritan girls are considered to be menstruating women from the time they lie in their cradle. Samaritan men are then considered to be those who engage in intercourse with menstruating women. It's kind of like you can't win. It's interesting. If a Sadducee girl follows the ways of her ancestors, it's likely that her impurity is like one of the Samaritan women. So her ancestors presumably being of that line. But if she has abandoned the way of her ancestors to follow the Jewish ways, she takes the status of a Jewish woman. Excuse me. This I found really interesting. A menstruating Gentile woman, a Gentile Zava, okay, remember that's the one who's even in special issuance of blood, and the leprous Jewish woman after the time of birth are all placed in the same category. According to Beit Shammai, they are considered ritually pure. Quote, the halachic status of the blood of the Gentile woman is like that of her saliva and her urine, which impart impurity only while moist. That sounds really weird, and again, it's not a comfortable subject, but there's a lot of detail on that, being that if there were an issuance of something that then dried, that does not qualify as the same sort of level of impurity when it comes to imparting that impurity on a different object. So if you want to read about that, again, you can. But what that basically means then is back it up that even a menstruating Gentile woman is considered ritually pure. It's like, oh no, it's like dried saliva. I don't even know what to do with that. There is a portion that this is where it gets a little more rough. Okay. There is a portion that refers to parameters based around the scenario of one engaging in intercourse with a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old. Okay. The commentary on this is very clear. This is not promoting this action. Not even condoning, for that matter, right? Rather, what it's doing, it is setting the halachic rights given to the girl and her family if a rape of this nature should occur. Okay, so it's identifying the act at this age as being a sexual act. A later tractate asserting that if there were damage to the hymen at any age younger than this, that it would repair itself. From this age and beyond, it does not, thus robbing the girl of her virginity, and she deserves the right of marriage, not to be divorced, not to be cast aside. That there are different things when it comes to a levirate marriage, whether, goes to the right of dying, her husband dying childless, all kinds of crazy things that then all this does is say, yes, if this should occur, she has the rights of a married woman. Okay? This also then refers to the parameters observed regarding a marriage, to a priest. That's what I said. Okay, so there are parameters then applied to a boy of 9 years and a day. Same kind of thing. There are discussions talking about what that means in applying certain parameters of Torah to given situations. And look, when you read through it, it's Talmud is very dry, matter of fact, and almost clinical when discussing these, so it can seem really jarring. and it is, but know that it is just laying out these parameters. It's like reading the law, right? It's almost like a legal document at this point. If such and such happens, this is what you have to do to deal with it. This is a quote. With regard to a girl who is 11 years and 1 day old, her vows are examined to ascertain whether she is aware of the meaning of her vow and in whose name she vowed. Once she is 12 years and 1 day old and has grown 2 pubic hairs, which is a sign of adulthood, even without examination, her vows are in effect. With regard to a boy who is 12 years and 1 day old, his vows are examined to ascertain whether he is aware of the meaning of his vow and in whose name he vowed. Once he is 13 years and 1 day old and has grown 2 pubic hairs, then even without examination, his vows are in effect, and one examines his vows throughout the entire 13th year until his 13th birthday. Prior to that time, 11 years and 1 day for a girl and 12 years and 1 day for a boy, even if they said, "We know in whose name we vowed and in whose name we consecrated," their vow is not a valid vow and their consecration is not a valid consecration. There's a lot of detail given to discovered blood, and about whether it can reasonably be attributed to menstruation or not. Where was it found? How long ago? Could it have been from an animal? Etc. It's detailed and interesting. If a woman with a regular cycle expects to see blood on the 15th, this is a scenario they give, but doesn't see it until the 20th, she should abstain from intercourse on both days. If this continues consistently for 3 months, she is to consider the 20th her new day of the start of her cycle, and it is permitted for her to engage in intercourse on the 15th. The 3-month period being one where she's abstained from both in order to be sure. So you can see there is a lot to be considered in all of this, and where the difficulty again of the tractate is nested in the caveats. Like, but if this, it all keeps kind of changing, right? In the case, this is a quote, in the case of a young woman who saw menstrual blood before marriage, while she was still in her father's house, Beit Shammai say, the sages give her permission to engage only in relations that consummate a marriage, which are a mitzvah, after which she is ritually impure due to the blood. Okay, let's break that down. While in her father's house before getting married, she discovers that, she's on her period. The wedding's happening that night. Beit Shammai says the sages give her permission to engage only in relations that consummate a marriage, which are a mitzvah. Okay, so it's the higher commandment is to do the mitzvah of consummating the marriage. After which she is ritually impure due to the blood. So then she would still observe her 7-day period of separation. And Beit Hillel say, there's this sort of caveat, the husband and wife may engage even in several acts of intercourse, as any blood seen throughout the entire night is attributed to the torn hymen. So as if this is something that would otherwise be attributed to that natural part of the act, that then they would consider that just to be one of those things that then they can engage in the act for the evening, consider that to be where that blood came from, and then basically the next day would be like, oh, that's a different kind of thing, so let's observe this as a period of Niddah. So then you would have 7 days, okay? So there, again, these situations have happened. All right. So, in any discussion about cleanliness, this is the bottom line. We have to draw the line between something like communicable diseases versus ritual impurity. Some discussions surrounding Niddah are designed to be specific about that distinction, because it's not as if there's any prohibition to becoming ritually impure. You can't keep from becoming ritually impure in these situations. So it's not a sin, right? There are prohibitions regarding one's actions when they become impure, and that's what this and other discussions are always concerned with. Many of the things that pertain to whether one can go to the temple, or whether they can eat ritually pure things, that tends to be the point of what Niddah is all about. Obviously, that can make some of these actions of ritual cleanliness seem irrelevant these days. So it's worth asking if there's a benefit to taking these actions anyway. For one, obedience is nothing to scoff at. We follow Torah because in it there is a spiritual truth and a physical manifestation. And why we have to be careful not to let the physical actions overtake a spiritual reality. The physical act of separation from one's spouse during the Niddah period should be a strengthening of the spiritual and emotional bond through the abstention from the physical bond. There are fertility benefits to waiting in this period. It helps to build a temperance between couples for times when physical intimacy may not be an option for an extended period of time for any number of other reasons. Cleanliness also, though, is a required state when it comes to presence before God. That's the mikveh before going to the holy place, to the temple, right? And yet, thank God, that's not our job. It's not up to us to make ourselves clean. We know, like I said before, that the red heifer ash is something that was used to make the Niddah. I don't want to stumble over my words there. The water of separation. Still, Hebrews 9:13 and 14 say, if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from the dead works to serve the living God. All right. Look, this is not an easy subject. It is encouraged in just about anything that you're going to go find on the subject that a young couple, as part of sort of premarital counseling, would actually sit down and have this discussion with somebody. In fact, I would encourage that so that not everybody is even as well versed in their own bodies and cycles enough to make these considerations, let alone in the context of a Niddah separation. And so it's probably worth having that discussion with your spouse. It's worth having that discussion with a rabbi, with someone that can help break down these sorts of things with you, and where you can make the considerations and determinations that are going to be right for your household. Because the important thing is to observe the Niddah period, because look, even prophetically, it matters. The period of separation, the idea that certain things are there, to everything there is a season, to everything there is a time, right? There is something where you just can't ignore the parameters that God has set up and that He has done so for a reason, but we want to understand why. We want the spiritual as much as the physical, and we can't let the physical overshadow the spiritual, right? So let's walk through some of these together. If you guys do have questions, this is a more complicated thing. I just want to say thank you for sticking through it, because it's one of those where we have to put a little asterisk on, maybe the PG-13 content of it all, but it's also a discussion that we just have to enter as human beings, right? So we might as well just be content with that and understand that even God has laid out parameters in our very bodies for us to be able to glorify Him. So Baruch Hashem. And I hope you all enjoyed that, learned something, and feel free to follow up with us here. Shalom.